I don't think they really wanted to find the person. Now, I'm not saying they didn't go through the motions and they would have accepted it if they had found out, but I think they didn't really want to find the person because it would only add to my number two takeaway here, which is certainly one end of the ideological spectrum just reviews the Supreme Court now as a weapon of politics and power and has no respect for it whatsoever and was willing in this moment to try to change a Supreme Court decision. You know, we talk about changing, the refusal to accept election results and a threat to our democracy. This was effectively a sabotage of the Supreme Court, which, let's all remember, in 2000, the Supreme Court has decided how an election will go. So you could even make an argument that the sabotage of the Supreme Court goes to the ultimate level of our government. This was massive. And I think the ramifications of this will last a long time. And it's very hard for anybody to make the case now that the Supreme Court hasn't just become entirely now politicized in a way that is irretrievable. And I think that's where we are. And I think the justices all kind of know that.
It's actually where I want to start right now, Buck. I read this report that was issued on the full investigation surrounding the leak of the Dobbs report, Buck. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was they required everyone to sign an affidavit under penalty of perjury that they had nothing to do with the leaking of the Dobbs affidavit. And everyone signed that. It's almost like you're trying to catch somebody by their refusal to sign that affidavit as a sign that they may have done something that would be improper. But one aspect of the report that I thought deserved some discussion because it leads me to what I think likely happened here. First of all, it doesn't sound like they even questioned the Supreme Court justices. So they immediately considered all of them to be above reproach. But they did, in the questioning, determine that several different employees of the Supreme Court discussed the Dobbs ruling and their understanding of that draft ruling with their spouses or their significant others. Here's what I think happened, and I'm curious how you would analyze this. First, I think it's an awful precedent that we are not catching whoever leaked this opinion because it sets in motion the possibility for further contentious cases in the future, the idea that you can do this and get away with it. And I think it may well happen again in another contentious case. And so, given that this directly led to an assassination attempt on a Supreme Court justice in Brett Kavanaugh and has led to consistent protests outside of Supreme Court justices' homes, which the federal government and the state governments in both Maryland and Virginia, and also the District of Columbia, again, the federal government, don't seem at all interested in curtailing and stopping. Buck, I think someone was smart here. They got a printed copy of this proposed ruling. They brought it home. They discussed it with their spouse. They put it down on a table and said, I can't do anything with this. I am duty-bound under my Supreme Court responsibilities and code of ethics. But you, meaning the spouse, meaning the significant other, are not similarly constrained. I think based on reading this report, that's likely the way this got out. One of those people, maybe it was a clerk, maybe it was an employee, brought home this ruling, this proposed draft opinion, and put it on the table, discussed it with a significant other, and the significant other took it straight to Politico. Because I'm thinking about it also from Politico's perspective. If you got this, like Buck, if you and I suddenly got a story of this significance dropped on our front doorstep, we would significantly question whether we were getting set up with something that was an elaborate hoax, an elaborate fake, right?
If your spouse works in the Supreme Court and they say this is the draft of the biggest Supreme Court decision in certainly a decade, and perhaps many people would argue much longer than that, you're going to think that that's real. By the way, I think it's interesting because I have some experience with this. I was in the CIA during a number of leak probes because of the war on terror, and people remember now some of the, the various revelations, things like waterboarding and things that we now all talk about. There was a time, when people discuss a black site somewhere, all these things, all these discussions that became very, very public. Initially, there was a huge surge within the intelligence community of outrage internally at how could anybody betray our trust by telling, Washington Post, you name it, any of these entities about this. And it's funny, you brought up the signing of the affidavit under penalty of perjury. That's very rarely are those things prosecuted, but it does have some legal teeth. It's different in an intelligence community context because immediately with the serious leak, you're talking about federal statutes under the Espionage Act where people can get sent to prison for decades. And that has for decades, not just for, a year or two. So, obviously depends on the severity of the leak and what people what was exposed and the intent behind it. But the polygraph is always one of the things that they want to go for right away for obvious reasons. Anyone who's read a spy novel and knows when they do counterintelligence work, they'll start saying, all right, we're going to poly everybody. And what they're really the easiest thing is when someone says, I'm not taking a polygraph.
It's
on
like
that
trying
one.
to turn around when you see a DUI checkpoint. Right? Like if you see one in the head of you and you're like, oh, I'm going to make a quick U-turn, cops are immediately like, yeah, let's go stop this person.
Let's
it's a
check
pretty
on that
good
guy
sign
for a
that you're
second.
telling on yourself in some way.
Yeah. My uncle, who was a law enforcement officer, LAPD, and actually Savannah PD as well. He told a story once that he was at there was a time when Savannah had a lot of shootings. It was a pretty violent city. It's now, as you know, I'm like a huge Savannah super fan. I'm always like, it's beautiful. I love it. I go any chance I can. And I do love it. But he was there in the 90s when things were rough. And I remember he said he was at a shooting and he just did the usual because people had gathered. It was broad daylight. People had gathered around. There's a body. They're, cordoning it off with the caution tape. He says, did anybody see anything? And he says, there's one guy who just yells, look, I didn't kill nobody. The guy puts his hands up, says, I didn't kill nobody. Turns out, Clay, that guy, when they continued to question him, because they were just, the question wasn't, it was to the whole crowd. Did anyone see anything? I didn't kill anybody. Turns out I didn't kill anybody. Actually, he needed a lawyer up. So, when you see these investigations, there's a lot of ways they can go forward in this regard, or, in terms of the tactics and the procedures they can use. I just think that my two takeaways from this are, one, I don't think they really wanted to find the person. Now, I'm not saying they didn't go through the motions and they would have accepted it if they had found out, but I think they didn't really want to find the person because it would only add to my number two takeaway here, which is certainly one end of the ideological spectrum just reviews the Supreme Court now as a weapon of politics and power and has no respect for it whatsoever. And was willing, in this moment, to try to change a Supreme Court decision. We talk about changing, the refusal to accept election results and a threat to our democracy. This was effectively a sabotage of the Supreme Court, which, let's all remember, in 2000, the Supreme Court has decided how an election will go. So you could even make an argument that the sabotage of the Supreme Court goes to the ultimate level of our government. This was massive, and I think the ramifications of this will last a long time, and it's very hard for anybody to make the case now that the Supreme Court hasn't just become entirely now politicized in a way that is irretrievable. And I think that's where we are, and I think the justices all kind of know that.
Do you agree with me on because I think if you assess the overall landscape and kind of contemplate what you know, the only way Politico runs with this is if they know that it is a very reliable way that it came into their possession, right? So it has to be whoever was their tipper has to be like, I brought this directly from my wife's kitchen table. She is the Supreme Court clerk for insert justice here. Or my husband is the longtime, secretary of the Supreme Court. I'm just tossing it. And he brought this home, and you can look him up, but it can't be from us. You're going to give us anonymity associated with how you got sourcing on this. But there's so many elaborate fakes. Politico was 100% right? This was an accurate draft opinion. everything that they reported around it was true. And I don't blame Politico for running with the story. From a journalism perspective, this is a big deal, right?
But also, Clay, I mean, it doesn't really, when they talk about in this draft that you mentioned, or the document, the 20 pages that the Supreme Court put out about the investigation, they're really, I mean, conspiracy to commit an offense against the United States or to fraud the United States, very vague, very broad. That would be a tough one. Power to punish, contempt of the court. Okay, maybe you could get it.
Here's a question I have. Yeah, you're right. Unlike, and you're raising an interesting point, because when you're working at the CIA, like you did, everybody knows if you leak documents, you're in real serious trouble because there is a criminal code specifically designed to address that. Why wouldn't Congress now pass a law that says if you leak a Supreme Court opinion, you are facing severe criminal punishment?
That's what
right?
I mean. I mean, you effectively, I think, have to treat Supreme Court drafts as, it's illegal to leak someone's tax returns. Notice how the Trump tax return thing, where they, for years, Clay,
yes,
they were obsessed with this.
Disappeared.
The ultimate nothing burger was the Trump tax returns. But because there's nothing specific here, there was a degree of good faith that the Supreme Court system relied on here from the people. It's small, not a lot of people have access to it, and someone violated that good faith. But all the different statutes that they lay out here, corruptly endeavoring to influence, intimidate, or impede an officer of the court, these are broad. They'd be kind of tough to bring. They don't have the teeth that I think that you would need to get a full-fledged, full-scale criminal investigation and prosecution going of someone like this. And you have to wonder, I mean, did they put a Supreme Court justice, or really several Supreme Court justices, in jeopardy with this action? In the CIA, what is the thing that more than anything else people think of as, this is why we have to protect classified
give away
sources
spies background and then put them
right
on the chopping block, right?
And anybody who's ever seen any spy movie knows, if the bad guys find out the identity of somebody who's spying for the U.S. government, that could cost that person their life. It could cost that person's family their lives. So the severity, the seriousness is very clear, hence the reason for the statutes that protect that information. Those, by the way, they've had to clarify even, and those statutes have become even more solidified and legally aggressive over time. But when you look at this, there's really, I don't think there's going to be much consequence for the person who did it other than getting fired and then going on the book, getting the book deal and the speaking tour. This person, this is another part of this, is a hero to the left. A hero to the left. There is no contempt for this individual from anybody who was upset about the Dobbs decision. They all think, hey, nice try, nice shot here. Sorry it didn't work out.
That's why I think that the House Republicans should introduce a bill making this a definite crime with significant consequences going forward in the event that someone does it. Because, to your point, even the perjury potentially in signing the affidavit in the middle of the investigation, while it might have legal consequences, you might lose your ability to practice law. Is it that big of a deal when you get a multi-million-dollar book deal to write the story of how you fought to try to keep Roe v. Wade the story? I mean, they'll make a movie about you. They'll make a television series about you.
Yeah, ask any lib. Would you rather be the hero in the next, Aaron Spelling drama that's picked up by Netflix about how you try to save a woman's right to her own body or whatever?
Aaron Sorkin. I think Aaron Spelling's dead, but...
Oh, I'm sorry. Aaron Sorkin, thank you. You know what I meant, Clay.
Aaron Spelling back in the day.
I
mean, Beverly Hills 90210, Dynasty, I think, if I remember. But
that's a
good
catch, because that might have been confusing. Folks like, Buck, why do you think that would be the right?
Yeah, Aaron Spelling, Sorkin, straight from 90210 to a documentary, the whodunit on the leak of the Supreme Court document.